On a May morning in 1916, the British Army executed James Connolly, a man so badly wounded he couldn't stand. So they strapped him to a chair. Firing squad. Done. And with that single decision, the authorities managed to turn a crushed rebellion into a legend with a martyr's face. Because here's the hard truth. The Easter Rising was a military failure. It was undersupplied, undermanned, and under any realistic illusion of holding Dublin against a modern empire. But it was also a political turning point, not because the rebels won, but because their enemies handled the aftermath with a heavy hand and a short memory. This episode is Easter week, 24 to 29 April 1916. 6 days that didn't defeat Britain, but did something more dangerous. They changed the argument. By 1916, Ireland had been living inside a grinding constitutional crisis for years. Home rule had technically passed, but the First World War shoved it into a drawer marked later. Ulster Unionists had mobilized, nationalists had mobilized, politics had started to look less like speeches and more like drilling. And beneath the surface, a tighter circle was losing patience. The Irish Republican Brotherhood, the IRB, didn't want later. They wanted a clean break, a republic declared, not negotiated. The war in Europe gave them a brutal logic. Britain was distracted. Britain needed troops. Britain couldn't afford another front. If you were going to strike, you struck while the empire was bleeding elsewhere. But even inside the nationalist movement, this was contested. The Irish volunteers were not a single mind. Their leader, Owen MacNeill, was not an IRB man, and he didn't believe in a suicidal gesture for the sake of symbolism. He wanted a rising only if Britain moved first. Mass conscription, mass arrests, outright crackdown. In other words, an uprising as defense, not performance. So the plotters tried to force the moment. They planned a nationwide mobilization around Easter. They sought German help, arms, and in some plans, a landing. That support went wrong almost immediately. A German ship carrying weapons was intercepted before it could deliver. Roger Casement, sent to coordinate elements of this plan, was captured. The big push was suddenly a smaller push with fewer rifles. Then MacNeill found out enough to panic. He issued a countermanding order that told volunteers to stand down. Confusion spread, numbers dropped, and the rising started in Dublin largely because Dublin was the one place the organizers could still force into motion. So, on Easter Monday, 24 April, they moved. They seized key buildings across the city. Not the castle, not the seat of British administration, but a network of strongpoints they hoped could be held long enough to create a political shock. The headquarters was the General Post Office on Sackville Street, modern O'Connell Street, because the GPO sat at the center of Dublin's arteries. From there, Patrick Pearse stepped out and read a proclamation declaring an Irish republic. And the proclamation matters, not as a legal document, it had no enforcement power, but as a statement of intent. It announced a republic in the name of God and the dead generations. It promised civil and religious liberty, equal rights, and it explicitly addressed Irishmen and Irish women. Whatever you think of the Rising, it was not framed as a local riot. It was framed as statehood. That framing was the point. In the first hours, the British response was uneven. Dublin Castle wasn't immediately taken, and at first there was real uncertainty about scale. But empires don't need to be quick if they can be overwhelming. Troops poured in, the authorities declared martial law, and the rising shifted from proclamation to siege. What the rebels had, in practical terms, were scattered garrisons. The GPO, the Four Courts, Jacob's Biscuit Factory, Boland's Mill, the South Dublin Union, the College of Surgeons by St. Stephen's Green, and a plan that depended on cutting movement, holding crossroads, and forcing Britain to spend blood and attention on Dublin. But what they did not have were heavy weaponry, secure supply lines, or the numbers to expand and link those positions under sustained pressure. And the city itself became the battlefield. St. Stephen's Green is the classic image. Volunteers digging in a park, then learning, fast, that open ground is a killing field when the enemy has height. British troops occupied the Shelburne Hotel overlooking the green. From there, they could fire down into the rebel positions. The rebels were forced back into the College of Surgeons, turning elegant architecture into a hardpoint. At Mount Street Bridge, a small group of volunteers slowed British reinforcements with devastating effect, using buildings and angles and patience. The tactical lesson was simple and would echo later. In a city, a few disciplined shooters can delay a larger force if the larger force is forced into predictable routes. But delay is not victory. Delay only matters if you buy you something. Civilians were trapped inside it all. Dublin in 1916 was a city of deep poverty and overcrowding, tenements, whole families in single rooms. When shooting starts in a city like that, the dead are not just the people with uniforms. As the week ground on, the British escalated. They brought in artillery, they used gunfire from the river, and they turned the central streets into a zone of rubble and flame. Fires spread, shops were looted. The city center began to look less like a rebellion and more like a catastrophe. So, what did the rebels think would happen? Some hoped for a wider national rising that never properly materialized, partly due to the countermanding order, partly due to lack of arms, and partly because national uprising is a phrase that sounds simpler than it is when people have families, jobs, and no certainty that the plan is real. Some hoped that Germany's involvement would shift the balance. It didn't. And some, particularly in the more hardline ideological strand, believed the rising didn't need to win militarily to win historically, that the act of declaring a republic and dying for it would break the spell of constitutional politics, that blood would be a kind of argument. By Thursday, the center was collapsing. The GPO, the symbolic heart of the rising, was under intense pressure. The building was battered, then burning. Communications were breaking down. Movement between positions was increasingly impossible. The rebels tried to relocate through back streets and lanes, but the net was tightening. And then came the decision that defines how Easter week ended: surrender. Pierce, as Commandant General of the rebel forces, issued an order to surrender to prevent further civilian deaths. On Saturday, April 29th, the rising was over. Militarily, finished. Dublin returned to British control. Thousands were arrested. Leaders were in custody. The city center was wrecked.
So why are we still talking about it? Because of what came next. In the immediate aftermath, public opinion in Dublin was not uniformly romantic. Many civilians were furious at the disruption, the destruction, the deaths, the ruin of businesses and homes. The rebels were not greeted as universal heroes on day one. That matters because it destroys the myth that the rising was carried by a single united national will. But the British response changed the mood. They treated the rising not as a contained rebellion, but as a lesson to be made unforgettable. They held courts martial. They executed leaders quickly. They did it in a way that looked less like justice and more like vengeance. Patrick Pearse, Thomas Clark, Joseph Plunkett, Sean McDermott, Eamon Cant, Thomas MacDonagh, James Connolly. One by one, men who had been to many names on a paper became bodies against a wall. And every execution did the same thing. It simplified the story. Because now it wasn't a messy event with confused orders, looting, tactical errors, and civilian anger. Now it was Britain shoots Irish leaders after they surrender. It was easier to understand, easier to repeat, easier to recruit around. Then came the mass arrests and internments, sweeping up not just organizers but plenty of people adjacent to them. And that is how movements harden. You throw a wide net, you pull in future radicals, you put them together, and you give them time. In prisons and camps, networks form, stories form, grievances become organized. This is where Easter week stops being a 6-day battle and becomes a long political fuse. There's another misconception to kill cleanly. Sinn Féin did not plan the rising, but after 1916, Sinn Féin became associated with the idea of militant independence in the public mind, and that association, fair or not, helped reshape Irish politics in the years that followed. And then there's the British administrative collapse in Ireland after the rising. Resignations, recriminations, policy confusion. You can see the state trying to decide whether Ireland is a security problem, a political problem, or both. And while it debates labels, the ground shifts. So the Rising failed, but it changed three things that matter more than a week of fighting. First, it put the Republic on paper, publicly, and tied it to sacrifice. A claim to sovereignty doesn't have to win immediately to be dangerous. It just has to be believed by enough people willing to organize around it. Second, it destroyed the assumption that constitutional politics alone would deliver independence. If home rule could be postponed indefinitely by war, then wait started to sound like never. Even people who didn't support the Rising could look at the aftermath and conclude Britain responds to force, not petitions. And third, British execution policy backfired. It turned a complicated rebellion into a moral drama, and moral dramas travel faster than detailed arguments. If you want one sharp way to understand Easter week, it's this. The rebels lost the city, but they forced Britain to choose how it would win it back, and Britain chose a victory that created more enemies than it destroyed. That doesn't mean Easter week was inevitable. It doesn't mean it was universally supported. It doesn't mean it was the only path. But it does mean that after April 1916, Ireland's political gravity moved, away from compromise toward confrontation. And that movement didn't happen in speeches. It happened in prisons, in funerals, in the silence after executions, and in the quiet arithmetic of outrage. Next episode, we follow the consequences, how the survivors and the newly radicalized moved from prison cells to ballot boxes, and how the language of rebellion became the language of elections.